Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider series. Today I'm very excited to have Kent Helfrich. He's the Chief Technology Officer of GM and the Head President of GM Ventures. Kent, welcome.
Thanks, Nicolas. So let me just start by saying that it's really an honor for me to talk to you and to really deliver some of the messaging about GM Ventures. And my whole path to this has been unusual. So I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk through that and to talk a little bit about the point of view that I bring to venturing and my whole job. So I've got about 35 years in the automotive industry, which happened overnight. My whole career, I've actually joined GM 3 times. I've quit a few times. The first time I quit, I went to a startup in Ann Arbor, in Michigan, outside of Detroit. And I was there for several years. And then I came back to GM for a very specific role because they called me and said, you would be perfect at this and we think that you'd enjoy it. Being in a large company is great for your own personal development because you can have many different careers in the same company. So that's where I really cut my teeth as an engineer. And we had some entrepreneurial opportunities. I have a background as an electrical engineer. At one point, I got an MBA in order for me to develop faster. And this was an interesting point because I was really focusing on experiences. This is part of my self-development journey. And level comes as a function of excelling. And if you're really focused on experiences, then the levels and progression follow. But one time, one of my mentors told me, he said, you can either live for another 10 years or you could go to school for 2, and that might be a more efficient use of your time. So that's why I ended up going back and doing the MBA, because that gave me, again, this adjacency knowledge, apart from just the pure technology and the technology leadership, that gave me a better understanding of the overall ecosystem. It allowed me to interact and network with people who are very different than I am. And in a large company, you tend to have your technical network in the industry. So allowing yourself to be tested against other industries is really important because that's where these accidental learnings will pop up and they make all the difference. I left GM again and I went to a supplier, Flextronics, who rebranded while I was there as Flex Limited. And we were originating the automotive group inside of Flex. And I originated the role of CTO inside of Flex. And that's why I learned the first rule of being a CTO, and that is your only job is to figure out how to say no and to focus. When you can do anything, the role of the CTO is to give focus and to say, that's a great idea and we're not going to do it. That allows the entirety of the organization to put all of their energy in a very focused area and increases the probability of success dramatically. And then I came back to GM, again, to search for a particular set of experiences, and that's led to where I am now.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack, but I'm going to pick one that I really liked. I think you made a very compelling argument about MBA when you said it helped you to test against other industries. And I'm sure we will talk about the 3 zeros of GM's vision, but this is a time where GM has to work with different industries than the automotive industry. And so tell me more about this tested against industries and how it's playing to you today.
Let me step back because you introduced it and it's really important. And this is GM's vision of 0 emissions, 0 crashes, and 0 congestion. 0, 0, 0. And being a vision statement, so this means that we have to change our entire corporate DNA. And when we're changing our vehicle portfolio, we're changing our overall corporate stance on a lot of things. And it's not changing, it's developing, and we're becoming more over time. And that requires us to be open to innovating with other groups and government entities and technology entities, because to solve these grand societal problems, 0 congestion is a great example. You have to have a very cooperative societal approach to this, otherwise you're not going to have that impact. So that means that we have to be able to work constructively with all of these other stakeholders, understand what their interests are, align our interests, make sure that everyone understands that our interests are aligned, and then move forward so that at the other side we're actually addressing the issues of society. And if you really want to go down a rabbit hole in what GM is really doing, because one of the things that I'm proudest of at General Motors is we say what we're going to do and then we do it. So if you go to gmsustainability.com, so gmsustainability, all one word, .com, you'll see everything that we're actually doing.
And I can sense the passion behind it. I still want to go back to your story, and one of the important parts is you did a startup quite early on. That probably gives you first an appreciation about how hard it is to do a startup versus being in a big company where a lot of things are done and helpful for you. But also it probably provides an empathy towards the entrepreneurs that GM Ventures is engaging with and that GM Corporation is engaging with as a consequence. Can you talk about how this changed the way you support GM Ventures in the mission and in the operations?
The thing that I learned earliest in my own work in a startup is that it's a double blind. The startup doesn't know what the pain points of the large enterprise are, and the large enterprise doesn't really understand what the startup can do, and more importantly, how the startup's ideas can be implemented or integrated.
This is so well said.
Yeah, and this is the crux of the entire asymmetric relationship between big company and little company, investor, recipient. And what we have to do as the investor and the big company, as a corp VC, is to level the playing field and make sure that the smaller company, the startup, understands that we are there to help them be successful. And that means having processes and a playbook that really aligns the interests of both companies. So inside of the office of the CTO, I've already mentioned two pieces.
Yes.
So there's ventures and there's R&D, but there's a third piece in here that does boilerplate agreements that we can use. So there's technology licensing agreements, strategic partnership agreements, material evaluation letters, as an example, all of which are pre-approved by the big company purchasing, legal, finance organizations, right? Because they are very protective of the big company. And if you take the big company language and you hand a purchase order, as an example, with the 2,000 pages of addenda that are referenced.
I hope you're exaggerating.
If you go through and you pull all of the reference documents, it's overwhelming to a startup, right? And so we make it very easy for a startup to say yes. And we also make it very clear that we're going to make them successful and that we are there to grow their pie. We are there to make their world better, and we're going to be their first and their best customer. All right. So in our agreements, we might have a time-limited area of exclusivity, but it's very clear to the startup that we intend for them to partner with other OEMs like us. By having that culture of trust and radical transparency, that makes it very easy for both sides to recover.
So you have actually described a few golden nuggets, but I'll start with the asymmetric. Many people talk about win-win. I like to talk about equal win, where it's actually symmetrical. Both have good values. And it's actually important to do that, because if you go for a small win and a big win, 2 years later, the one who's getting the small win leaves. Whoever had the big win is left with nothing anyway. So I think having this equal win, or what you describe as symmetrical engagement, I think matters a lot. Another golden nugget I really want to double click is a playbook. Because clearly you found a way to interface a big company with startups. And you made something which is bespoke for this type of engagements. Tell me about how this playbook has developed over time and how you're still refining it over time.
So from the beginning, you can tell when things don't go well that it's a lot of times due to this asymmetric relationship. And I've been on the other side of the relationship from a big company to a small company when I was at a supplier and with the startup way in the back. But I've also been on the other side of the table from research and ventures through the majority of my career. So I understand how the dynamics play out. So as I've watched this over time, what really stands out is when you start seeing some of this mistrust and it is allocated or attributed to process or legal or financial. You'll hear this kind of over and over again.
It's not about the solution.
And it's a red flag. It's a red flag that we are right now talking about part of this asymmetric relationship. So then what you have to do is pull out, and it sounds very process oriented, but it's really more about repeatability, trust, and speed. And then the radical transparency, and I keep using that, and it's a critical thought. It's radical because it has to be at the core of everything that we do. Everything is visible to both sides, and both sides have to buy in to the relationship and to the transacting of data and the transacting of trust, right? So by having this playbook, we don't have to keep retraining everyone in the corporate functions of finance and legal and purchasing. We can simply say, these are the agreed terms, and if we're changing the basis of the way we want to run this, then we will absolutely change these. But until then, we're going to leave it static so that we have this continued transparency and trust amongst all of the parties. Now, as soon as someone wants to start deviating from the playbook, there's good reasons to do that, but you want to do it sparingly and carefully, and maybe not at the beginning of the relationship. So we haven't really talked about GM Ventures' investment thesis, but maybe I'll just start right there. Generally speaking, we're looking at A and beyond. We want to see something that is a proof of concept, that is something we can look at. But even before that investment, we can have strategic partnership, an R&D agreement, a material evaluation letter that give us a head start on evaluation. And this is actually a really good idea, specifically for technologies that are integrated into something else. It's not a standalone subproduct or thing. In the case of GM and batteries, let me just zone in on that use case. There are tons of companies that have technologies that can be integrated into a battery, whether it's a cathode, an anode, a pure material play, an electrolyte play, something having to do with the structures and the interfacial dynamics of all of these.
The integration matters.
So someone will come in and say, I can reduce your costs by 30% and increase your range by 80%. Who doesn't want that? So I tell you what, why don't we do a very quick material evaluation letter? You send us something. We promise not to open it up. We promise not to do anything but take data and evaluate the claims, and we will tell you what we find. And that's all we're asking. We're going on a date. We're not going to get married. And everyone's interests now can be aligned on that little ask. That allows us to see if our data doesn't match their claims. That gives us the opportunity to start proving we assume competence on your side. What did we miss? We tested it like this. It showed us that. Help us understand. And as part of that, Ventures is watching, because we got the R&D folks and the Ventures folks working in this mix all the time. So they're aware of what's going on over here. And as soon as we get an indication that, hey, there might be something here, we've already got some of the groundwork done over here, and it's primed. The other important thing is, because of the way GM works, research and product development are very closely linked. So we've already got our big enterprise stakeholders in the wings, and we know what their pain points are, and we know how this technology with that startup through this process will address their pain point. And so that kind of gives us a running start on this whole thing. We're not going to invest and then look for someone who might be interested. We're going to find the companies that address the pain points and bring everyone along at the same time through the evaluation and investment process.
I love how you describe it. And I like to think about ventures as a superpower and having superpower from the corporation. But here, the way you describe it is a beautiful life cycle where every team in GM, whether it's product development, research, ventures, brings value along the way. And you could nearly argue each of them is critical to materializing the superpower. And so now I want to double click on the part of CTO office for ventures, because I think what you've just described, I think, is a glimpse of the value of that type of organization. Can you double click on that?
Let me start maybe by talking a little bit about ventures and our portfolio and our approach.
Right? And investment thesis.
Give that contextualization. GM Ventures has existed for 12, 13, we're on our 13th year now. We started investing in 2010. So that means we've got a bit of longevity in the investment idea. Currently, we've got just over 30 portfolio companies. And each year we'll evaluate we'll really evaluate north of 600, 700 companies. So in a typical year, we'll make maybe 3 to 5 new investments. We'll have a lot of follow-on investments, which gives us a chance to look at how is our portfolio actually doing. Our investment board inside of GM Ventures is a separate LLC. So I'm the president of that LLC, and that LLC is one of many inside of GM, the big company. Our investment board is made up of finance and 2 people from product development who are all at the VP level, and then me as CTO. So from a ventures perspective, the only person who's voting on the proposed investments is me. What my goal is to make the solutions so that the investments are useful to the pain points and deliver the strategic value that we need. My assumption is if we address the pain points and deliver on the strategic mandate, the financial returns will come. And that's been proven over the course of these 12 years. If you invest strategically and you keep focused on the mandate and the pain points of the larger enterprise, and these work out, some of them won't, but in our experience, most of them do to a particular degree, then the economic value will follow. So I'm saying we're going to measure that, but we're not going to focus on that. We have to deliver the strategic value to the enterprise so that everyone remains aware of what it is we're delivering. Because if you're this isolated island of ideas over here, you're going to get defunded. It's never going to have the legs. Getting back to the investment thesis, we have 4 main areas that we're focusing on these days is autonomy, electrified propulsion, the customer vehicle interface and displays and connectivity, and then digital enterprise.
I'll go back to this superpower because I think one of the things you've described is this very good understanding of pain points, finding the startup that can deliver on that pain points and help to deliver on this. Is that like a secret weapon in some sort?
It's not a secret weapon in the fact that we're very clear we intend to be these companies' first and best customers.
I want to click on this actually, because first customer is easy. Best customer is about mindset. How do you deploy that mindset? And it goes from recruitment to training to actually operation and execution. How do you cultivate this mindset?
Yes. So the culture inside of GM starts at the top. So Mary Barra and her senior leader staff set very clear expectations for how we're going to work. And we have behaviors that we talk about. And when you join the enterprise, not GM Ventures, but when you join GM the enterprise, you ascribe to these values, right? We've got these very specific things that if I act in a way that runs counter to that in a non-trustworthy way, I'll get called out.
Anyone can call you on.
And this is really important. And we spend time thinking about this, not to a debilitating extent, but to the extent that it adds value to the company. And it adds speed because I don't have to worry if someone's withholding information. Inside of GM Ventures, we do a couple of very important things. And this is really kudos to Wade Sheffer, who's the managing director of GM Ventures, and to his whole staff of partners, principals, associates, and analysts. They have acted in a way that is congruent with the GM behaviors, and they've been very upfront with our portfolio companies. They've been very upfront with our legal and purchasing and financial staffs, and over time, that has worked itself into just the way we do business. So that's number one. Culture at the company, and culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if you don't have a culture of winning and goodness, then any strategy you have about winning and goodness isn't going to take place. Our real goal is to be the world's greatest CVC.
Ah, okay. Talk more about this.
And this is aspirational because there are other CVCs that are magnificent, that are setting the bar.
Very high.
And we look at that and we say, that is to be admired, that's to be acknowledged, and we intend to be that and to be better than that in our own way, in the context of what problems we need to solve and what companies we can help solve the problems of our big enterprise. To not only be the first and best customer of the startups, but also to be the world's greatest CVC, you put those two things together, and you have to have scalable processes. You have to have an expectation of excellence. You have to have this culture of winning, but also of one team.
And partnering. I actually fully agree with that. I want to talk about decision making, and especially in the ventures space, in terms of how do you adopt a contrarian view? Something that's not obvious. Of course, it comes from high conviction about the pain point. But sometimes you will still build conviction in a contrarian view. How do you enable your team to build that and to potentially support it, even though you may not agree with it?
So the best way to deal with a counterintuitive or counterfactual argument or an alternative view to the status quo is to do very fast iterations so that you can have decision points. You say, listen, I know you don't quite agree with this. We're going to run the play for 3 months. And so today is, let's say it's April 1st. So May, June, July. All right. So on July 1st, we will come back to you and give you the status. And we're going to say, here's what we've done. Here's what we've observed. Here's how our thesis has changed. And then everyone's willing to go along for a couple of months on a contrarian viewpoint with transparency.
And trying to invalidate.
And it's just, we're going to let this lead us to where it leads us. And you also, in technology, it's very easy to color the response. So by having different tests, you can actually make it look better or worse. So you have to be open about how you did your tests and what the methodology was. So that's, you always look for the
intellectual honesty.
Yes, and you always have to look for the footprints on the, here's the, and if it doesn't say here's exactly how the data was
It
run.
really feels like the smaller the font, the more you have to watch them.
It's the same as in financial reports. The footprint, or those are always, the footnotes are always the most important thing to read.
That's what you learn in an MBA.
Exactly. That's where all the details are. So by being fast, you don't have to be as right. And that's also a key thing that everyone should understand. If I can rapidly validate or invalidate one key assumption out of the group, then that takes us a little bit further down our destiny.
I think what comes across is not just trust, but empowerment. And not just to your team, but also you mentioned to the startups, we say, okay, you're claiming this performance. Let's do a little test and we'll come back with the results. Very empowering, which I think is back to this best customer even before it becomes a customer. Tell me more about this open innovation, because at the end your role, even though you have multiple functions, they all intersect at open innovation. How do you ensure that you enable open innovation for a company that I know is open, but there's a default to think internal first, all big companies?
So open innovation is an important concept, and this has been around since the early 2000s. Cheeseborough is the guy's name, if you haven't, to the people on the podcast here, if you haven't looked up the original work around open innovation, you got to go back to the source there. The basic idea is to take internally generated ideas and externally generated ideas, combine them in a crucible. Some things get spun out, some things get adopted internally, and some things die of their own accord. All right, so this is meant to be 1 + 1 gets you 3, and it might get you 3 and 3. It might get you a whole bunch of different outcomes.
As long as you're open to the directions.
So now combine that with, I've got a group of researchers, eminent researchers, and they've been studying these problems for 20 years. And I asked them, give me your best thinking on problem X. They're going to go to the shelf. And they're going to pull off the best thinking, right? Here it is. It's all, my best thinking is pretty well understood here, and I've got it all lined up. And then you bring in a startup whose ideas don't necessarily align with that. So the immediate natural human reaction is to look for why that won't work and why this is the best thinking there was. And part of our culture is to throw them together. And the number one thing that I want to see in ventures and in R&D employees is intellectual curiosity. You have to be extremely curious and self-motivated to challenge your own orthodoxies and to challenge your own mindset and to enable other people to say, you're not thinking about this in an appropriate fashion, whether it's not strategic, not enough stretch, not enough orthogonality with your mindsets. We talk about valuing diversity. We value diversity in a lot of different ways inside of GM, One of the ways that's really important in this space is intellectual diversity. People who are trained in different sciences, people who were trained in different schools, because schools do, a particular school and a particular professor, advisor can give a mindset and a worldview which is permanent and sometimes limiting, sometimes debilitating, right, over the long run. So we have to find people who are curious enough to let go of some of these things and say, yes, even though I believed that, I now believe this. And then the rest of the world has to give those individuals grace and space to change.
Grace and space.
This is really important. And that's, again, part of the culture. I know you said that. We see this. There's something here that's different, and there's something here that's valuable. It may not be better, but it's at least admissible, and it just get people going. It is, again, insufficient to have the most optimized answer to a problem space. You must have the answer that is actionable by the enterprise. So it has to be the best attainable option, not just this one up here. So if you've got researchers who are focused on this, MBA students are great at this. I got this analysis. This is the position where we need to end up. And you say, this over here is, oh, you're selling short. There's a whole bunch of discussion that takes place. You're being limited by the status quo, et cetera, et cetera. I'm all about realized value over time, and it's an integral. And the quicker you can get that value, the quicker that you can get that area under the curve realized.
I like the fact you mentioned integral and I love the fact you mentioned curiosity, because at the end, curiosity is the best way to avoid the trap of the local maxima, where you found your local maxima and you're comfortable in it. Actually, curiosity will help you to explore further away. I love it. Thank you so much, Ken. It was amazing.
Nicolas, thank you.